Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Thanks so much for waking up after all that raging. Hopefully you guys are excited to hear about the history of video game music. We're going to be taking a comprehensive and chronological look at how video game music has evolved over the years.
So just a quick introduction to the three of us. We are the Super Marcato Brothers, and that is a pun, but it's also because we actually in real life are brothers ourselves. Carl and I host a podcast called Super Marcato Brothers Video Game Music Podcast, and Marty is, we're very honored to have him as a third Marcato brother guest for today's panel, and he's
brother from the same mother.
Yeah. So we're going to be taking a look through the history of video game music by way of the history of video game consoles. So we just want to give a quick disclaimer. Even though video games are a relatively new medium, they have a history that spans many decades, and this is by no means a comprehensive look. We can't talk about every video game console. I mean, we can't talk about all of the things that we want to, but we're going to take you from sort of the early console generation to where we are today, and hopefully it can satisfy enough of what everybody would be looking for when they come to a panel called The History of Video Game Music.
Cool. So starting not exactly at the beginning of intentional music for games, but quite close to it, especially when we think of consumer home consoles. This is the Atari 2600. Maybe familiar to some of us, and this was really one of the first kind of widespread opportunities to bring the video game into your living room and to play it on your television. And the Atari was capable of producing music. We'd probably describe it as quite primitive, kind of with today's perspective. It really had a two-channel pulse and noise chip. We're going to be using a lot of these terms as we go through the following consoles. A pulse channel, sometimes we'll refer to it as a square channel. It's a very basic sort of synthesizer sound. And when we're talking about noise, we're talking about almost that sound of white noise or static that, again, we don't really encounter it on modern televisions, but
Back in the day, you used to turn on a
TV. When you turn between radio stations, but we don't do that either. But if you talk to your grandfather or great-grandmother, they can describe that sound of the white noise.
I'm sure there's an app that emulates it.
And with these two simple elements, the early Atari composers were able to actually make music to support the games.
Well, I think it's interesting. If you look at early Atari games, music was kind of an afterthought. A lot of times the developers of the games had to provide their own sound, and that included the music as well.
The music, they were more jingles. It was doodle-da-da-da-da, you know, kind of things like that.
We thought it would be fun to play an example near the end of the Atari's life, just before the NES came on the scene, to show you what is kind of really at the time the peak of what was possible on the Atari. And this is another example of the developer of this game actually handling all the sound and the music as well. So we're going to play a little bit of Pitfall 2: Lost Caverns, and that handsome gentleman is David Crane, who designed the game. So let's take a listen to what David was able to achieve on the very primitive hardware of the Atari 2600.
So I think maybe some of us can hear possibly some influence from film music, composers like John Williams, and I do think adventure movies like Indiana Jones were very influential to a game like Pitfall. I think a lot of early, and even to this day, game developers really wanted to get in the headspace of almost interactive movies. And I think even from the early days of game music, that's sort of evident in the approach to a soundtrack. Now, this sounds primitive by today's standards, but as Carl was mentioning, this is quite sophisticated for the Atari, and it's kind of uncommon for an Atari game to have such rich, lively music like this. As we mentioned, it was mostly just almost musical sound effects in little moments of interjection or transition. You think of like the music to Pac-Man or any of the early arcade games. It's not necessarily background music. It's more like little jingles that play when you die or you get an item or something like that.
Well, this is such a special example because not only is it more foreground music, but there's actually, I don't know if you guys heard, there was a tempo change in this track.
Right.
which was absolutely unheard of at the time.
And with those primitive channels that we were describing earlier, there's really quite a full sound. There's like a groove that's coming from the noise channel, and we can hear this harmony. I'm seeing a couple hands raised. We will make sure to leave a fair amount of time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions.
Absolutely, we will have plenty of time for that for sure.
So moving right along, this is the Nintendo Entertainment System, known as the Famicom in Japan, and this is kind of where, for the purpose of today's panel, this is kind of like where everything started. You know, when we walk around MAGFest, I'm sure all of us are constantly surrounded and bathing in the sounds of classic video game music. And I think it's interesting that all these decades later, I would still say a majority of the music that we're all still celebrating and talking about was created for this iconic, beautiful gray box.
Let's hear it for the NES, folks. So this was released in North America in 1985. The Famicom, which was the Japanese name of this console, was released 2 years before that, and it really busted everything wide open. If you're talking about video game music specifically, which hopefully we can focus today, talk mostly about music and not just video games in general, the NES was a total game changer. So compared to what we had previously with something like the 2600, we have 5 total sound channels that these composers and sound designers could work with. Now, 3 of those are for pitch. So some people, I hear a lot of people that say, oh, the NES could only produce 3 tones at once. They're talking about specific pitches,
Right.
bass, harmony, melody.
So if you have a chord, the most basic idea of a chord, you know, we've heard maybe of major chords, minor chords, C major, A minor, D flat major, that kind of a thing. The most basic chord you can create is what's called a triad. It's basically a 3-part harmony. You have a root, a third, and a fifth. And the NES had just enough pitched voices to be able to create that sound of the triad. And all of the music that we know and love from the Famicom days, with the exceptions of some that used an expansion, were just made using that 3-part harmony ability, which is just phenomenal to conceptualize.
Yeah, so I mean, we have something in common with the 2600. We do have the use of the noise channel, a lot more customization, a lot more options with this noise channel, a couple of different modes to get some really cool futuristic sounds. Very common to use that for a drum sound. Depending on how you use the different frequencies, you could evoke a kick drum, you could evoke a hi-hat, you could evoke a snare drum.
And also interesting sound effects like an explosion or, say, throwing a fireball.
Yeah, I think a lot of us don't realize this. I know I definitely didn't when I first was getting into this stuff years ago, but the way that most of the drums were produced on the NES was through this white noise channel. It was essentially almost like different pitches or layers of white noise, and then adding sort of a volume curve onto it. So instead of having, you now had, and then you play that in a beat,
And you get a drum beat.
It starts to sound like what we're used to listening to NES music.
And the 3 tone channels that we're indicating, 2 of them are sort of a step up from what we were talking about on the Atari, pulse channels or square channels, as we sometimes refer to them. And on the Nintendo, they had a little bit of customization. You could switch what's called the duty cycle and change the timbre of the sound. So something like could be or could be those are all the same pitch.
That was beautiful, Marty.
Oh, I think I was practicing all night. And so there's that level of customization with those 2 channels. And then the 3rd pitch channel was quite limited. We refer to that as the triangle channel, and that was usually utilized for bass, partly because you couldn't control the volume of it at all. It's either on or it's off, and it actually has a really resonant sound in the lower frequency. It's, say, on the low side of the piano, if you're picturing it that way, and has this interesting overtone so that you can hear the notes even if your television isn't able to produce much bass.
I think one of the most important things we should mention today is that these specific limitations on the NES were so crucial to establishing the sound of video game music and what composers years after on systems that had much better sound technology, it all stems from the creativity that was required to work within these limitations. So we should play an example of a fairly early NES piece of music that uses just the 2 pulses in harmony, the bass for the triangle channel, and pretty simple use of the noise channel for drums. This is a little bit of Wicked Child. Let's hear it for Castlevania composer Kinuyo Yamashita. This is Wicked Child. Take a listen to the bass coming up here. We're gonna get pretty dancey.
How the sound changed there? In the intro, you had mostly using the second duty cycle, and now it's using what's called the first duty cycle. But to us, it basically sounds like an instrument change happened. It's like the equivalent of going from a clarinet to a violin. But the great thing about the early days of chip music is that you really did have to use your imagination. It's like the graphics in an old NES game or the story. It encourages imagination, and the great thing about that is it allows video game music to be much more eclectic because it doesn't need to be nailed down. A lot of this, it sounds like guitar music and rock music, but you could also imagine it maybe having some orchestral touches, or maybe it's supposed to be a pipe organ. Who knows? But I think
it is supposed to be a pipe organ.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the cool things about those primitive sounds is they can evoke real-world instruments, and definitely like how idiomatic the writing would be for guitars or something like that is very effective, but it also leaves room for it to be anything.
Yeah, I totally agree. We should also mention just how wonderful Yamashita-san was, and that what's fascinating about the history of video game music is that it actually features very prominently a lot of incredible female composers.
Right.
And that's something that here in the West, I feel like we're still kind of wrestling with. We're still kind of contending with how can we invite, celebrate, include, and praise more female composers. And actually, at what many of us consider the dawn of video game music, it's very female-driven in a really amazing way, and I think that almost separates it from almost any kind of history of a particular music that I'm aware of.
Well, especially for the Castlevania series, because in addition to Yamashita-san, Michiru Yamane is probably one of the most famous Castlevania composers who's still working to this day.
We should talk a little bit about the sound chip itself. The sound chip of the NES was actually designed by Yukio Kaneoka, who was an early employee of Nintendo. And I don't think anyone at the time, including Kaneoka-san, would have imagined that to this day in 2019, I think most people would still say that the NES sound is maybe the most beloved and nostalgic sound, and people are still making chiptunes. They're still making new music.
Well, there's
with
something
this.
magical about that balance. We talked about it yesterday in our panel, the VGM sound, but the idea of three-voice writing, it's a unique challenge, but it led so many composers to this idea of clear and singable melody, clear and very necessary harmony to that melody, and then a bass line that can both imply the groove, the rhythm, and also outline chords in many cases. It's a really strict limitation, but I think it led some of gaming's greatest composers to do their finest work. I mean, I think it's no mistake that it happened on this platform.
I think it's worthwhile to play a second example on the NES to show, even within one console, how much evolution there was. This was when video game music was changing so rapidly. And if you think about technically what was capable in 1985, an example like Gyromite, versus what happened a little bit later on, one of the things that we didn't hear in Gyromite or Castlevania was the use of the sample channel. And so I think we should take a listen to something that
there was a very
uses
primitive,
that.
very low resolution sample channel also on the Famicom, but it really would have, in terms of their concept of disk space on the cartridge, it really required a lot of disk space. So a lot of early games wouldn't really utilize that channel at all. But as the programming became more sophisticated, a lot more composers had access to using that sample channel.
For drums, and in the case that we're going to play bass, if anyone's familiar with Ghostbusters on the NES, there's that sound, Ghostbusters, when you push the start button.
Just gorgeous, yeah.
But that's the kind of sampling that we're talking about. But eventually composers got smart enough to use that to sample the sound of a snare drum, the sound of a kick drum, and the sound of an electric bass, amongst
so
other
sampling
things.
a bass, just imagine that. That means that they're sampling a bass at every pitch that they would need available for that piece of music, and then they're calling upon those separate pitches.
Now
So
that
would inform the
technique-
composition and,
Right.
and sort of limit it as well.
The technique of sampling bass was almost exclusively done by the Sunsoft composers. So let's play an example of a track by Naoki Kodaka. Let's hear it for Journey to Silius. Any fans out there? So this is a nice example to see how far the NES was able to be pushed at the time. I think this is about 5 years from the release of the NES in North America. Let's take a little bit of a listen to Stage 3 from Journey to Silius. So what's so striking about this is how much like legitimacy and real performance is evoked by that sampled bass. It almost sounds like an entirely different console. You get
Right.
that bite and that grit of like a real synth bass or like a bass with overdrive.
Right. I think the cool thing in this case is I don't believe that's a sample of an actual electric bass, but the level of distortion, right, the level of distortion that comes from that, what's called the DPCM sample channel, is it almost gives it the sound of like a distorted or overdriven
The
pick
same
bass.
distortion from the Ghostbusters
Right.
sound effect.
It's actually
That was there
it's
the whole
it's
time.
it's desirable. It makes that instrument have a level of grit and character to it that's perfect for something rocking like this. The other thing that it does is it frees up another pitch channel. So if
Yeah.
the bass information is being covered by that DPCM channel, that leaves the triangle channel to do other things, sometimes tackling harmony or melody. But in the case of this Journey to Silius track,
Drums.
Naoki Kodaka actually uses it, to sound like the sound of a tom, which
Do, do.
that happens in a lot of NES games. If you think Mega Man 2, and where they're actually using the triangle channel and they put what's called portamento on it, which is sort of a smooth transition between notes, but they have a portamento fall down. So rather than hearing you hear boo, boo, and when that's done fast enough with a short enough attack, you can almost imagine it sounding like striking.
This panel should just be vocal impressions of chiptunes, because this is
We'll
really
try
entertaining
to keep it
for
to
me.
a minimum, yeah.
All right, it is time to move on to the next generation. Let's hear it for the Sega Genesis. We did mention before, we don't have time to cover every single console, but we're going to cover quite a few of the consoles today. And I think it's time to talk a little bit about the Sega Genesis. This was such a leap forward, especially if you're talking about the NES. The amount of different timbres and sounds and textures that was capable on the Mega Drive, or in North America, the Genesis, is amazing. You also had different types of sounds working together. You had FM channels, which stands for frequency modulation, which is a little bit more of an advanced and intricate synth sound. You also did have PSG channels, which very similar sound to the NES, to the Game Boy, to the Master System. So the combination of both of those types of synths working together, as well as one sample channel and a noise channel, all of that working together, you had 10 total sound channels. So a lot more lush harmony was possible. You were able to evoke real-world genres a lot more, and that's why you hear a lot of that incorporation of jazz and funk and rock on the Genesis. It really did that so well because the sound was better, but you're able to have more lush arrangements.
Well, and this time on the NES, you could play 1-bit samples on the DPCM, and they had to be very, very short. Where on the Genesis, you could play 8-bit samples, which almost all the drums were now utilizing samples, kick drum, snare, things like that. The other thing to mention about the Genesis is it had this Yamaha frequency modulation chip inside of it. But if we remember back to a lot of popular music of the day, so much of it was using that FM sound, that kind of distinctive
especially
Yamaha
for
FM
bass.
sound.
There's so much
Yeah.
80s music that has FM synth bass in it.
So that's one of the advantages that the Genesis had going for it, because we can listen to it now and say it still sounds primitive, but compared to what people were familiar with home console music at the time, this sounded much more akin to something you would find in the arcades, and
Yeah.
a lot of it, quite frankly, sounded pretty similar to some of the sounds you would be hearing on the radio.
And there's something about the Genesis and FM synthesis in general that sounds very forward compared to the older consoles, the way they synthesized music. It's almost as though it's being produced in an amp directly from your keyboard.
Yeah,
right?
there's a lot more bite and grit and attack and precision and punch to the sound of FM synth. And there's a reason why so much Genesis music really embraced that sound and made music that was hard-hitting, music that wouldn't have made a lot of sense on something like the NES. Let's play an example. I would say middle of the generation of the Genesis, maybe getting towards the end a little bit. We're going to play something from Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Let's hear it for Sonic 3, everybody. So this piece of music was potentially composed by these two gentlemen. There's a lot of interesting lore behind the composition of Sonic 3. I think these two weren't officially credited as composers, but after some research and some digging, most likely these two composed this track. We're going to play a little bit of Angel Island Zone, Act 1, and then let's talk about what we're hearing and how this is such a step up from where we've come. That was PSG right there.
Does anybody notice that 4 on the floor kick drum?
A lot more bass heavy, so the EQ sounds much different than what was capable on the NES. It's such a full sound, and compositionally, I mean, this is one of our favorite pieces of video game music we could spend a lot of time talking about, but the interaction that you're hearing here between the FM channels, the arpeggiating PSG channels underneath, the sample channel for the drums, and the noise doing that kind of dancey hi-hat, all of it's so full and so, like, nothing's missing here.
When we talked about the effect of instrument switching on the NES, so using the different duty cycles, but what's great about the Genesis is with the FM, there's so many more variables, so you can have exponentially more different timbres and instrument sounds, and you also have more channels. So the arrangements now had the potential to become more complex, and you could have all these different interlocking lines. In this track, what's so amazing, I love this little roll at the beginning. I really feel like it's trying to imply the sound of like rolled steel drums. And the cool thing about the Genesis is even though it's still synth, it's not a sample of a steel drum, they're able to kind of accurately evoke real timbres because they could program these synths in more nuanced ways.
Well, think of how well that matches the visuals of the beginning of Sonic 3 when you're flying across this tropical island.
If you remember, Sonic and Tails are flying on the plane, and they enter.
One thing we should quickly mention, some of you might be scratching your heads, we're going out of order a little bit chronologically. You may think we're skipping a console. So the Genesis was released in North America in 1989, so we're kind of going by release date of these consoles. I know this came out in '94. So a little bit later example, but
another interesting, some food for thought as far as the Genesis writing and the compositional approach goes. You know, if this had been really the first kind of consumer available console, it's very likely that our traditions and our aesthetic of video game music would have been different. What's interesting is even though these composers have access to more channels, it still seems like it's inheriting quite a lot from the style of writing from the Nintendo. It's still very bass and often two-part harmony driven, and particularly with the Sonic music, they're using those additional channels for interesting kind of counter lines, usually with some kind of like twinkly sound that's pushed much further in the background. So it's really fascinating seeing the thread that kind of continues from the early days of consoles, even as the technology continues to advance.
Absolutely. Well, I think it is time to move on to the next console. Let's hear it for the Super Nintendo, folks. You've been waiting patiently for it. I think if we took a poll of everyone in the room, what's the best console? Should we do that? Maybe at the end.
No, let's not.
Let's not do that. That's a bad idea.
I don't want people to
We don't
break out
incite a
into
civil war,
open fighting. Yeah.
One of the best consoles of all time, though, we can definitely say. And similar to the Genesis, really represented a huge leap forward, arguably even more so than what was capable before. So the sound on the SNES, so different, such a different approach than something like the NES. We have 8 total sound channels. They're all sample channels, which means that every game could theoretically have its own sounds. That didn't happen. And there's more sample packs that were used by multiple different composers.
And that's thanks to Nintendo. They were actually hugely proprietary about giving these materials to developers.
Yeah.
sounds kind of creepy now, but it's actually that type of mentality is one of the things that saw them so much success in the 80s and 90s, is how kind of tightly guarded they were.
But there were plenty of
licensing.
examples of people that maybe Western composers that made their own samples, and so a lot more uniqueness and diversity in sound from game to game. And having sample channels, there's a lot of control that you can have. There's some primitive effects that was capable, such as reverb, full stereo panning for the first time, not just mono or not just down the center, all the way left, all the way right, full stereo panning. So a lot more atmosphere and vibe was conveyed with the music of the SNES. Different genres were explored that wouldn't have made sense before, also wouldn't have made sense on the Sega Genesis. If we think about so many classic JRPGs on the Super Nintendo, they went for this orchestral, kind of moody, atmospheric, almost film sound.
And we should say it's a much higher resolution of a sample than we heard on the Nintendo.
Or the Genesis.
Or on the Genesis. And it's probably a good moment to pause, because this will be a recurring theme when we're talking about Nintendo's approach to consoles, is they're going their own way here. It would have seemed like a really natural progression for any other studio. Oh, we have a synthesizer-based chip. What's the more advanced synthesizer that we can have in the next console? And here, Nintendo is kind of defying a lot of expectations and taking a very different approach to how they're going to move forward.
There are so many advantages. Carl just mentioned the great things about the sample channel, what you're able to do. But one of the ironic things is that what the Super Nintendo seemingly was not great at was doing synthesizer or rock-based music. There's examples, like Mega Man X, that are actually sampling guitars. And as cool as that is, composers found all these problems because since they were using samples, they had to deal with issues of like instruments being out of tune, and a lot of times when games were ported from the Genesis to the SNES, they actually had to sample these synthesizer sounds and put it into the Super Nintendo. So it wasn't ideal in that sense, but the possibilities were more limitless.
Because you could actually produce a real-world sound of an instrument, a piano that sounds like a piano, a violin that sounds like a violin.
And I think there's a reason why so much music on the SNES, when we think of SNES music, I think most of us have a genre in our head, and it's a different genre than we would think of with Mega Drive music. We wanted to play, though, a very quintessential early example of the SNES. This is actually from a launch game, so I know the chronological nature of this is going a little bit wacky here, but let's play the little bit of the overworld. Let's hear it for Koji Kondo, Super Mario World, everybody. Let's take a listen to this and then we'll discuss.
There's a quote that we shared in our earlier panel, Koji Kondo talking about his initial struggles with the Super Nintendo, and really what he was curious about was, okay, now we have access to these real-world sounds. Will it feel like video game music? Will it feel connected to the tradition that came before? In this case, a sequel to a really beloved set of games. And so the approach that he devised was basically to embrace very eclectic instrumentation. And he found that something about that eclecticism captured the spirit of those early video games. So here we have steel drum with mandolin, banjo, and sort of a saloon piano,
tuba,
and other pieces of music.
Something that sounds like a tuba. The interesting thing about Mario World is that also it's still, the great thing about the Super Nintendo, you're still able to use your imagination. They evoke real world sounds more so, but the way that these samples are manipulated, pitched up, pitched down, they almost have a synthesizer-esque quality to them innately. And he uses a lot of like pitch bend and everything. But there's so many other cool techniques that are on display in this track that you might not necessarily notice at first. In that opening, one thing you might hear almost like a chimey sound as a part of that instrument. Carl, could you play just the very opening of that again? You hear that lead instrument, it almost sounds like the melody has a chime to it, but it's actually two different sounds. And what he's doing is he's taking the notes of that melody and transposing it up like an octave and a fifth. and it gives it a whole different timbre. And it doesn't sound like that when you're listening to it, but it's actually a technique that happens on, if you've ever seen like a church pipe organ, that they'll have certain stops that if you play a middle C,
a Hammond organ.
Yeah, you're not actually just hearing a middle C, you're also hearing other notes that give it a little bit of a different sound. In this case, it almost has the effect of like strings in an orchestra doubled by, glockenspiel.
But it's
or
not an
bells or
effect that
something.
was, say, native to the Super Nintendo. It would have to have been something that the composer intentionally arranged.
Well, so I think what we're getting at with the Super Nintendo is it's such a magical mixture, because, like Will mentioned, you still have to use your imagination. These aren't good sounds. These don't sound like real instruments. It's very clear that it's fake. It kind of is that general MIDI kind of 90s sound. But the composition is so strong and is moving from the tradition of the NES, moving into a little bit more incorporation of genres that weren't possible before, much more expansive compositions, longer loops, a lot of tempo changes, and so taking what was done before and really moving to the next level. We should kind of speed along here and make sure we have time for everything. Let's talk a little bit about the Sega Saturn. We're going to play a quick example of a track as we discuss what was really interesting about this particular system. So this is a piece of music called Rough and Lady from Guardian Heroes, and let's talk a little bit about the Saturn. This represents a very important leap forward in the history of video game music. I don't believe the Saturn was the first console to have CD audio, but it is definitely embodiment of that. More often than not, when we think about the sound of Sega Saturn, we think about early recordings, orchestral recordings, rock, fusion recordings like this. This is a real recording here. And that's very, very important. It did have a built-in FM synth chip. Some games did use that, but more often than not, the composers opted to go with the Red Book audio. And the interesting thing about that and other consoles at the time, like the PC Engine CD, is that it didn't seem like there was as much following the traditions of the past as far as the NES, Game Boy, Genesis, SNES. It seemed like composers were more interested in trying something new that had never been done in games before.
Well, and there was a responsibility now put on the composers to be producers of their soundtrack. And of course, they were producing the soundtracks on the early consoles, but there are so many decisions that are made for you because of how those consoles work, where now you're having to go into the recording studio and produce like a traditional record producer. And we see some composers really soar in that kind of environment, and for other composers, that was a brand new challenge. And it may have been too much of a challenge.
Well, it's also an area where sometimes their eyes were bigger than their stomachs, where I think the idea of like there are no rules now, we can record anything, but once you're dealing in the avenue of like actual recorded music, there's a certain level of taste and craft. It's an entirely different art form. And so I think sometimes when we listen back to some music of this era, it has with it kind of the corny, cheesy sounds that we associate with music production back in that day. Gated reverb on the drums, kind of poor quality instrument samples, and really sort of an overblown sound that, for whatever reason, when we listen to the Genesis, when we listen to the Super Nintendo or the NES, it doesn't have that. There's like this charm to it of like the computers trying to impersonate human music.
Well, isn't that ironic? I don't think people that worked in the Saturn and PC Engine CD and consoles we're going to move to, I don't think they had any idea of that. Isn't it ironic that in some ways the Genesis and even the NES kind of holds up more nowadays, which is very surprising and interesting. Let's move on to PS1, everybody, PlayStation. Let's hear it. So this is a really interesting point in history because at this time, there's so many different approaches to video game music, and we had some missteps and some stumbles as composers and sound designers were having to now create their own recordings. The PlayStation was interesting because it did have a pretty expansive sample chip, but it also did have Red Book audio as well.
So what's interesting is the Saturn was a similar scenario where you could have full CD quality audio, but it also had an FM chip. It was like the next evolution of the Genesis.
Right.
And what's interesting about the PlayStation is it's kind of like the next evolution of the Super Nintendo, where it has a much more advanced sampling capability like the SNES sound, and it also has the ability for CD
that's
quality
interested
audio.
in the history, actually, you may know that the PlayStation originally was going to be a venture that was partnering Nintendo and Sony, but there was some behind-the-scenes drama that changed the course of.
Well, yeah, it's also worth noting that Sony made the Super Nintendo sound chip, so their sound chip for the PlayStation is very similar in sound. Just more channels, a little bit more customization.
So,
but
like, if you've ever
not that
listened
different.
to the music to Final Fantasy VII and thought, like, wow, this really sounds like a continuation of the music that you heard on the Super Nintendo Final Fantasies, part of that is to do with a lot of the music is using that same sampling technology, which is one of the cool things about the PlayStation, is that you kind of could have that linkage to the 16-bit.
So this is fun. We're going to play another Castlevania example, and it's cool to hear how even this series has evolved. This is a soundtrack that does feature Red Book audio. Let's hear it for Castlevania Symphony of the Night in Michiru Yamane, folks. A living legend. Let's take a little bit of a listen to Dracula's Castle. So what I find so great about this example is this feels like this is carrying the torch of classic video game music. It reminds me of early Castlevania, but it sounds better. You're hearing it with real instruments, synthesizers, more convincing drums. It's a beautiful example of carrying the torch, learning from the past. You know, Yamane-san actually worked on the Genesis with Bloodlines, and so she worked even on earlier systems as well with Konami. So she's someone who has been around for so many different generations for video game music.
Well, and there's a parallel technology history that we're not going to get into explicitly, but that has a big impact on video game music. And that's the technology that was available to musicians and composers, specifically virtual instruments. The virtual instruments available at this time, at least for our standards, are quite primitive. You can tell that that's supposed to be a violin section, but in the actual implementation of it, something sounds quite false. And
more akin to something you would find on like a Yamaha keyboard or something in the 90s.
So even though at this point we're almost at a similar technology as far as the console goes as what we're used to today, which is basically completed, finished, high resolution audio, but the technology behind the scenes on the composing side was still kind of catching up.
What I love about Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and this track in particular, is that even though it's using this CD quality audio and is, because it's recorded music, that sort of vibey, moodful intro, you couldn't do anything like that on the NES, and most likely not on the Genesis or Super Nintendo. But yet it does have this catchy melody. Dun, da, 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 dun, da, 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 dun, 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 dun. Now, a melody like that you absolutely could have done on the NES or the Super Nintendo. And so what's cool about Symphony of the Night is it's taking things forward and utilizing the technology, but it's still written in the tradition of video game music, where it's all about a singable, memorable, catchy tune.
So this was a very interesting era in video game music because this saw the start of, in some ways, a split of philosophy when it comes to video game music. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about the Nintendo 64, everybody. So technically speaking, the sound-wise, definitely a significant step below the PlayStation. There's no question about it. This was a lot more akin to the SNES. There's some 64 soundtracks that when you listen to them, you're like, oh, am I listening to Super Nintendo or N64? It didn't really represent that much of a step forward sound-wise. And actually, it was even more difficult to work on the 64 because it didn't have a dedicated sound chip. We're going to play an example of how these composers are able to rise above those limitations, which is something we've heard in the past, to create something truly timeless and wonderful. Let's take a listen to this. So one reason why I love talking about the N64 is that it truly, it's classic Nintendo and it's classic video game music because these composers had to rise above, again, very strict limitations, and the only way they were able to do that was to compose knockout melodies and timeless themes that people would hum and remember for years and years. We're still talking so much about Ocarina of Time, Mario 64.
Well, strong melodies, but really just strong composition overall, and
Yeah.
supporting the gameplay in really unique ways. And obviously, we speak a lot about Kondo-san, but he is really the godfather of so much of this.
Well, and I think something that he really had an unfair disadvantage. I mean, this was happening at the same time. The N64 came out a year after the PlayStation, so for it to be this much more limited, but it, in terms of the caliber of video game music and the number of memorable compositions, it was really neck and neck with the PlayStation. And a lot of that has to be owed to the caliber of composers that were working on the N64.
But when I talk about the difference in philosophy, that came out of limitations. The PlayStation didn't really have a lot of limitations, and so because of that, composers were much more free to do what they wanted to do, and sometimes that worked out great. Other times, not so much. With the 64, there's plenty of bad and mediocre soundtracks, but the ones that have held up, the only reason why they've held up is because the quality of the composition is there. There's really nothing else that you have to work with.
And it's interesting, we noted earlier with the Super Nintendo that Nintendo kind of takes their own course as to how they're going to proceed with the console design, and it was actually very successful for them. And in the case of the Nintendo 64, we're talking about the audio chip as being very limited compared to the competition, but this was very successful for them. And really a lot of their core launch titles like Mario 64 have influenced the entire video game industry, and some of the most beloved soundtracks of all time also come from this system.
So I think the next generation that we can move to, and we do have to really speed along with the rest of this, unfortunately, if we're gonna have time for questions, is I guess I would say the Dreamcast, PS2, very similar time frame. We don't really need to separate these generations as much anymore. Sound technical wise, we're there's not really much difference from the PS2. How it's implemented is definitely different. But at this point, these composers are having to flesh out their own recordings. And the combination of using virtual instruments with real instruments, they're getting a little bit more skilled at fusing that together. This is an interesting example. Let's play a little bit of Silent Hill 2. Let's hear it for Akira Yamaoka, everyone. Let's hear how the virtual instrument technology has progressed in maybe 4 or 5 years. Wait for the violin to come in. You're going to hear a sampled violin coming up here.
Maybe it's a cello.
A lot more convincing.
So the thing is what's great is it definitely, Carl mentioned, it sounds much more like the real thing than the Castlevania example that we heard. But by today's standards, I still don't think this is going to fool that many people into thinking this is real piano and real violin. But we're getting there. It's the next evolutionary step. And like Marty said, this has more to do with the technology that's available to composers rather than the technology that's available to gamers and consumers. I mean, it's not really, it's not that the PlayStation 2 was more advanced, that the music was more advanced. It's more that technology for composers was more advanced, so the music started.
And it would have been just as possible, say, if there had been an astronomical budget to have the London Symphony Orchestra recorded at Abbey Road on the PlayStation 2. So yeah, again, we're talking a lot about the technological kind of limitations of
and as the years go on, being able to record an orchestra has gotten a lot more inexpensive, and so it's one of the reasons why we hear it more nowadays. Let's talk a little bit about, let's hear it for the Xbox, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to speed along as we discuss this. It's kind of confusing because in some ways you could pair the Dreamcast with the PS2, but you could also pair PS2, Xbox, GameCube. So let's play a quick Xbox example of video game music, classic quintessential video game music in this era. Let's take a little bit of a listen to Halo, composed by Marty O'Donnell. Let's hear it. Now we're cooking.
One of the great things about Halo is even though Marty O'Donnell doesn't necessarily, he's not a Japanese video game composer who worked on the NES, that principle of eclecticism that Marty mentioned earlier is absolutely on display in a track like this. Maybe for different reasons, but I think it's why the Halo music is still kind of like stands up as one of video games' classics. It's very memorable and melodic, but it's also the combination of instruments and genres. We have rock guitars mixed with these kind of tribal drums and orchestral sounds. It's like, yes, that's the sound of video game music. It isn't just one thing. It's all of these ideas coming together.
It's that fusion.
We've said this before, that the eclecticism, that's almost part of our video game culture, and it's definitely alive and well here at MAGFest.
Absolutely. All right, so now this is a really interesting era for video game music because it really did seem like those two philosophies are so much more etched in. We have Sony and Microsoft really trying to be on the cutting edge and making video game music that sounded better than ever, and then we have Nintendo. But the compositions.
A disk drive console, and again they subvert expectations. It's like, no, it's going to be a mini disc, and it's going to be the most beautiful looking console that you've ever seen.
Well, and it's going to sound basically like the N64.
Well, the thing that Nintendo did so great, you could compare it to the visual approach in the Wind Waker, that by going for that cel-shaded look that I know was controversial at the time, the game still looks great and it holds up. And the music, it's a similar philosophy where it's like, if the melody is strong, if the composition is clear and earnest, it's gonna sound good. And it's like, honestly, when you listen back to CD audio music of the time, there's that like music production of several decades ago where now it sounds uncanny.
The uncanny valley, that's really at play here. And Nintendo tries to stay kind of far away from that, from even trying to bridge the uncanny valley. And I think it's kind of held up.
Yeah, it's to their benefit and their great success. But yeah, interesting. Again, they're blazing their own trail here, but the quality and the caliber of melody and composition is as strong as it ever was.
And it's so interesting. Time and time again, the recurring story with Nintendo, even if we had a history of Nintendo video game music, is setting up their own limitations, but then rising above them almost every time. So let's move on to the Wii. Let's hear it for a little-known console, the Nintendo Wii. Has anyone heard of this? Oh, okay. Cool. This is maybe the peak of what the Nintendo Wii put out musically. Let's hear a little bit of this. Mario Galaxy 2, everybody. So Nintendo music has come a long way, right?
And also interesting that we're seeing it's kind of a tight-knit family. Of course, there are many other outstanding Nintendo composers that we're not showcasing, but so much of the core team that was responsible for those early classics are still very much involved.
Yeah.
Right, and the cool thing is Koji Kondo, same composer, did Mario World and put together that eclectic ensemble, but now he's writing for real instruments in the orchestra, and you can hear the same distinct compositional voice in certain approaches. Earlier, he was having the glockenspiel, those kind of mallet percussion chimes, doubling a bit of the melody. It's not that dissimilar to what he was doing on the Super Nintendo with that intro where I called out those chimes. It's like, yeah, he didn't have the instruments back then, but the same compositional craft is on display. So of course, when he gets to use an orchestra, that level of craft is going to be there, and so is the melodic gift and everything.
I think Mario Galaxy, the first one, really represented a historic point for Nintendo. It was one of the first times when they were finally embracing where we currently are in video game music and what fans might expect for a soundtrack. Very, very important turning point. And when we think to where we are now in 2019, there's almost no going back. You know, I don't think we're going to hear a big budget Nintendo game that sounds like Wind Waker again, where, you know, their focus on production has really stepped up. Yeah. So let's play an example from a similar era to the Wii, PS3, Xbox 360. Let's take a little bit of a listen to Welcome to Rapture. Let's hear it for Gary Scheinman. I think it's safe to say that in this era as well, Nintendo was beating to their own drummer. And when you think about classic music for the 360 and the PS3, and then you think about classic Wii music, more often than not, they couldn't be more different.
Right. Even if they're both using orchestras, it's like nowadays you have a lot of Western film composers and people who have no history with video games, or even people who do, they're not really writing anything that sounds like it could have existed on the Nintendo or on the Sega Genesis.
And they shouldn't feel beholden to
Right. But what's cool is, at least in Japan, you have so many legendary video game composers that were working back in the 80s, and they take their same compositional approach. People like Yasunori Mitsuda, Koji Kondo, Yuzo Koshiro, Manami Matsumai, that are still working and writing music, and it's like it's still melody driven, it's still groove driven, it sounds like video game music, even if they're able to create a piece of music that sounds contemporary.
And sometimes they're creating chip tunes again. Sometimes they're
Right.
creating music on the PC-88, like Yuzo Koshiro will still compose PC-88 music.
So, I mean, talk about eclecticism. Now it's eclecticism in terms of variety in video game music. You can have someone like Gary Scheinman, who used to teach composition at the University of Southern California as classical composer, and someone like Koji Kondo writing at the same time in the same medium.
Right. Yeah, in some ways it's almost, is there anything that constricts video game music? Like, it really could come kind of from almost any source and represent any genre.
All right,
We should probably
very
speed through these.
yes. Just a little bit of the Wii U. There you go. That's good. Let's representative, right? All right, let's move forward and talk a little bit, just very briefly before we answer some of your questions, about basically where we're at this point. Some different release years between these consoles. We're going to play an example of where we're at to this day in video game music, and this is a delightful example because it really feels like it's kind of embracing the uniqueness of video game music. Scoring for a video game is so different than scoring for a film, scoring for a television show.
What has evolved behind the scenes is that we're not usually merely needle-dropping tracks, particularly in the big AAA titles, but the composition is really quite evolved and involved. And so composers are usually recording multiple stems and layers of a particular piece of music, and then depending on the gameplay, your own interactivity is actually kind of choosing what happens next in the piece of music. And this is a really great example of how far that's come.
Any Spider-Man fans out there? Let's take a listen to a little bit of City of Hope.
John Paisano.
Soundtrack to Spider-Man is, Marty mentioned how interactive it is. I mean, you're swinging around the city and you're hearing this beautiful, rich orchestral score that sounds like something out of a film, and it scores the moment-to-moment action the way that a film score would. So that's the incredible thing. It's not just the richness of the music, but the way that it's implemented. It's sort of we can't really demonstrate that here in this panel, but that's the way that game music is continually growing and evolving.
John Paisano even described when he finally played through the finished game, he was like, did I write that music? Because actually the transitions were also so musical, and it really takes a village to produce a...
Yeah, we should mention, in order to get a result like this, it's very expensive and very time-consuming, and much more difficult than, in some ways, working on a film score.
It's funny to see that that idea of multiple layers of recordings, or you could say multiple layers of samples, that was there all the way back on the Nintendo with that 1-bit sample channel. So it's funny, while if we go back to the 80s, it seemed like a lot of the industry thought it's about synths and it's about advancing the synths. And we mentioned Nintendo kind of going another way with focusing on the samples, and that caused a lot of challenges for their composers, but it does seem as though the industry has moved towards samples, and it's not going to go
So
back.
as we answer some questions, we'll play this in the background to show you guys where we currently are with Nintendo music. Let's answer some questions. Who's got them? Right up here. We'll do second row first.
So I think
Right.
I think part of it has to do with the idea that a lot of game composers and game developers really loved cinema and loved film, and a lot of game composers, especially like in RPG games, they really wanted to write film scores. So they would write these motifs and these themes that would come back again and again to be related to characters in the way that they would in films. But yeah, I also think that you're right, and that the limitations of the hardware almost necessitated the idea of, melody. It's a monophonic idea. It's just one note at a time, and it's something we can sing, and it's something that's very human and personal to almost all music. And so by having a strong melody and a strong theme, it's almost the most useful way of creating memorable musical imprints.
Especially when you only have a few voices, for
Yeah.
sure. Absolutely.
And I think that's an excellent question, and a question composers should probably be asking themselves.
Let's try to get a couple more in here. We'll go over. Oh,
What about first row?
we'll go right there.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
You in the first row. I didn't hit it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Definitely. In some ways, its own topic, its own tradition, its own panel. That would be really awesome.
I'd say by the time you get to the Sound Blaster, very similar kind of production of the synthesizers to the Genesis. If you played any of like adventure games on a Sound Blaster or something, very similar kind of sounds. But we think of most of those games as being produced in the West, either in Europe or America, and so actually the compositional perspective is probably the bigger difference.
When I think of a lot of those composers, I think of people let to their own devices to feel free to do whatever they want to do. When I think of some of the examples we played, it was more of an all hands on deck, more of a collaborative approach.
And a big difference between the West and Japan in terms of composers is a lot of, in Japan, the companies had, I think, a longer history, and so these were like corporate salaried employees that were working for a company and given more strict directives. And you could say whether that's a good or bad thing, but it did yield some of this amazing music where it, based on my knowledge, like a lot of people in the West, they seem to be more left to their own devices, smaller teams, smaller budgets, kind of more individual stuff, at least in the early days. And I think that's a big result of
See if
the
we can get a couple more
Genesis.
in. Who's got? Let's go back there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. His issues with the sound chip. Talarico's talked about how easy it was to just hop on his keyboard and bang out things very from Gen. What role do you think the sound chip from Genesis played in attracting more conventional composers from outside the game, like Tom Talarico?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think we did see a lot of strong, say, keyboard-based composers, a lot of composers with a lot of band experience. The Genesis was a much more natural fit, or really any kind of FM composing, arcade composing as well.
Yeah, it's cool. When you listen to Masato's demos of Sonic and Sonic 2, his original demos, I don't know if you've heard them, they're surprisingly similar to the sound that we get in the,
It's mostly
in
just
the
at
actual
a
game.
lower tempo.
The other thing, though, is that there wasn't one uniform way that music was implemented on these platforms. I mean, Takashi Tateshi-san yesterday and was talking about this, about how, and he mentioned it when we were talking to him, but that he actually would compose the music, and Yuka-chan's papa, Yoshiro Sakaguchi, was the person responsible for implementing the music and programming it. But then you also had examples of, we spoke with David Wise. He was the one implementing and programming his own music. So there were so many different ways of doing it, and you had composers who worked back then who didn't know any of the programming side. They were simply working on the composition.
And it
then
depended a
people were
lot on a
also
lot of the
programming.
middleware tools, particularly for the Genesis.
Right. Tommy used like a MIDI controller.
Yeah, so
He used GEMS, which was a tool that was basically only available for American Genesis
So for
composers.
some other development teams, it was actually a lot more difficult, even implementing things on the Genesis.
Well,
I
we
think
have
have one more question.
yes.
The gentleman in the purple.
What would you say? You said that most composers, as soon as the Red Book era started opting for that for recorded audio, what would be the advantages of still utilizing FM synthesis for sampling?
Well, it's that uncanny valley concept that we talked about, which I don't think anyone was thinking about back then. But the idea that it's like when it's clear that it's not the real thing, your brain is forced to use imagination, and you really focus more on the composition, which is why I don't think a lot of people that grew up with video game music listen to the NES and say like, oh, why doesn't it sound more like a clarinet? Why doesn't it sound more like a guitar? You just accept it for what it is and focus on the music, and it's actually better for that because your imagination fills in the gaps. Where when it's clear that you understand what you're listening to, it has the potential to be in that uncanny space of like, well, I can tell what I'm listening to, but something about it doesn't quite sound real. And there's so much nuance to recording and engineering that's its own art form.
And there are probably other practical motivations too. Less disk space, not using kind of full sampled audio, and for some development teams, probably even a faster process of implementing things that way.
I think that is our time. Yeah, if you guys have questions, we'll be hanging out over there, so we'll be
talk to
around.
us,
Thanks
yeah.
so much for coming out, guys.